Hey guys, today we step into a world that somehow got by without fries, without ketchup, without mashed potatoes or marinara. That is right. We are diving fork first into why medieval Europe never ate potatoes or tomatoes. And trust me, once you realize what they were eating instead, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Picture this, a 13th century kitchen. Smoke curls from a soot-stained chimney. A clay pot simmers above the fire. Its contents a questionable mix of barley, cabbage, maybe a bit of salted pork if the household was lucky. There is no garlic bread on the side, no roasted potatoes with rosemary, and definitely no pasta swimming in red sauce. It is bland. It is beige. It is aggressively fibrous. That is because two of the most iconic ingredients in modern European food, potatoes and tomatoes, were entirely absent, completely unknown. To a medieval cook, they did not exist, which meant entire recipe categories did not either. Instead, medieval diets leaned heavily on what could be grown locally and withstand harsh climates. Grains like barley, rye, and oats were everywhere, boiled into pottages, baked into dense loaves, and ground into flat cakes. Root vegetables played backup: parsnips, turnips, carrots the pale ones, not the sweet orange modern kind, and onions. Lentils and fava beans filled the gaps, especially for the poor. One mainstream historical fact: potatoes and tomatoes are native to the Americas, and they did not arrive in Europe until the late 15th or early 16th century, after the medieval period had ended. That means everyone from Charlemagne to Joan of Arc to the average pig-farming peasant never once laid eyes on a spud. So what did they eat when the fields were muddy and the larders thin? Bread, more bread, cabbage boiled until sadness. And if you were feeling wild, maybe some leeks with mustard seeds. Entire meals passed without a splash of color. Nutrition came in shades of brown. Here's your fringe tidbit. There were medieval cookbooks, but they were written by and for the upper classes. One 14th century recipe for green sauce includes parsley, vinegar, and breadcrumbs. Not bad, but still no guacamole. And absolutely no tomatoes. Those were still growing quietly on the other side of the Atlantic. Blissfully unaware they would one day fuel pizza night. Historians still argue whether the absence of New World foods truly limited medieval European diets, or if local biodiversity was rich enough to compensate. There is evidence of creative use of herbs, wild greens, and fermented flavors, but the sheer variety offered by later imports, totally missing. So next time you scroll through a food app, debating between gnocchi and spaghetti bolognese, remember, medieval folks did not even have the ingredients to dream that big. Their world was bread, broth, and whatever did not rot too quickly. And in those fields of rye and rows of leeks, no one could imagine that a humble red berry and a knobby brown tuber would one day change everything. Across the muddy lanes of medieval villages, meals came and went without any splash of tomato red or golden crisp of a roasted potato. That is not because cooks lacked imagination. It is because Europe literally had not discovered the ingredients yet. The entire continent was living in a gastronomic bubble, blissfully unaware that halfway across the world, some of its future favorite foods were growing wild in mountain soil and jungle gardens. Enter the Columbian Exchange. But not yet. We are still centuries away from that maritime mix-up. In the 12th or 13th century, tomatoes and potatoes were doing just fine in their native habitats. South and Central America, the Incas were cultivating spuds in the Andes. Aztecs were growing tomatoes as both food and ornamental plants. And Europeans, they were busy debating whether garlic was too spicy. One mainstream historical fact: The Columbian exchange did not begin until after 1492, when Columbus' voyages triggered an accidental botanical revolution. Plants, animals, and diseases leapt oceans, changing agriculture forever. But to our medieval friends, the New World might as well have been Mars. Nothing from it was on the menu. So let us walk through a typical market in, say, 1350. You will see baskets of onions, parsnips, beans, apples, perhaps a smoked fish or two. What you want, TC, anything from the Americas. No maize, no peanuts, no chili peppers, and certainly no tomato stalls beside the alewives. And here's your quirky tidbit. Long before Europeans tasted potatoes, they had a vegetable called skirret, a sweet, starchy root from the carrot family. Some tried to mash it like potatoes later would be mashed, though it had a fibrous texture and a strange aftertaste. It never caught on widely. Potatoes would eventually blow it out of the water, but not for another 200 years. Historians still argue whether the medieval palate was content with what it had. Some suggest that Europe had developed a complex food culture using local herbs, preserved meats, and fermented elements long before global spices arrived. Others argue that medieval cuisine lacked the depth and variety we now take for granted, and that the post-Columbian infusion transformed not just flavor, but nutrition and population growth. But in the thick of medieval life, no one knew what they were missing. They were not craving mashed potatoes. They did not mourn the absence of salsa. They lived within the boundaries of what their soil and climate allowed, and those boundaries stopped at the Atlantic Ocean. So as they stirred barley gruel and chewed their 50th turnip of the month, the cooks of Europe had no idea that entire categories of cuisine, Italian pasta with red sauce, Irish shepherd's pie, French ratatouille, were still centuries and oceans away. And when the ships finally did arrive, carrying strange seeds in their bellies, the reaction would not be instant excitement. It would be suspicion, confusion, and a hefty dose of superstition, because unfamiliar foods in a superstitious world, that was a recipe for mistrust. When the first tomatoes finally made their way across the Atlantic in the early 1500s, Europeans did not jump to slice them into salads or simmer them into sauces. Instead, they stared at them like they were cursed. To many, these strange, glossy red fruits looked far too much like something grown in a witch's garden. Or worse, something that could kill you just from touching it. And they were not completely irrational. Tomatoes belonged to the nightshade family, a botanical group infamous for containing some truly deadly members, like belladonna and mandrake. The leaves of the tomato plant do have toxic compounds, and in an age where herbal knowledge often blurred with folklore, people were understandably wary. Red, shiny, and growing low to the ground. That sounded more like a trap than a treat. The potato did not fare much better. When it arrived, it was lumpy, earthy, and alien. Europeans had no idea what to do with it. It did not grow above ground like most respected vegetables. Instead, it hid in the dirt like something trying not to be eaten. And as any medieval herbalist would tell you, food that hides has something to hide. One mainstream historical fact: for decades after their arrival, both tomatoes and potatoes were believed by many Europeans to be poisonous. Tomatoes were sometimes grown as ornamental plants in gardens, but not eaten. Potatoes were fed to livestock or tossed out entirely in some regions. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 18th century France, yes, even that late, a man named Antoine Augustin Parmentier famously hosted lavish dinners featuring potatoes, just to prove they were safe. He even had soldiers guard his potato fields by day and let thieves steal them by night to make the crop appear valuable. Medieval people did not get that marketing campaign. All they saw was a strange root that might kill them in their sleep. Historians still argue whether fear of new foods was primarily rooted in religion, folklore, plain ignorance. Some believe the church played a role, associating unfamiliar plants with temptation and sin. Others point to the lack of culinary infrastructure. No cookbooks, no proven recipes, no preservation techniques. You do not just toss a new plant into your stew without knowing how to avoid turning it into poison. Tomatoes were also associated with lust and heat. Not the kind you want in a stew, but the kind whispered about in confessionals. Some texts even linked their red color to blood and their round shape to forbidden fruits. There are records of them being referred to as love apples, which sounds romantic until you realize people thought eating them might corrupt your soul or inflame your humors. So while the tomatoes ripened on vines in Spanish gardens and potatoes began to sprout in Irish soil, most medieval diners kept a safe distance. The food looked strange, the stories were ominous, and in a time when eating the wrong mushroom could ruin your week or your lineage, it was not worth the risk. It would take decades of experimentation, trade, famine, and stubborn farmers to change minds. But eventually, suspicion gave way to curiosity, and curiosity, as we know, is the gateway to dinner. Long before potatoes became the signature dish of peasant plates and tomatoes painted European cuisine red, both were dismissed as either useless or dangerously exotic. Ironically, the very foods we now associate with simplicity and comfort were once considered unfit, even for the desperate. In early modern Europe, not quite medieval anymore, but close enough to feel the echoes, potatoes were often viewed as animal feed. Farmers threw them to pigs or buried them when the stench got too strong. They were cheap, yes, but so were leeches, and no one was putting those in a stew. Tomatoes, meanwhile, were occasionally kept in gardens for show, bright red and oddly shaped. They looked good next to roses, but had no place on a dinner plate. The elite called them love apples, but nobody was making tomato soup in a monastery kitchen. Most peasants would not have even seen one, let alone cooked it. One mainstream historical fact: for generations, both potatoes and tomatoes were slow to catch on because they were not part of the existing agricultural or feasting traditions. Crops like wheat and barley were taxed, tethed, and traded. New vegetables. They had no institutional support. Monasteries did not grow them. Nobles did not demand them. Markets did not trust them. Here's your quirky morsel. In 17th century Germany, some towns used potatoes as punishment food. Prisoners were fed nothing but boiled spuds. No salt, no butter, just plain soggy tubers, until they begged for mercy. It was not seen as nourishing. It was degrading. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of being served plain oatmeal for eternity. Historians still argue whether this stigma was entirely cultural or partly economic. Some suggest the resistance to potatoes came from landowners who did not want to disrupt traditional grain production. Others argue peasants themselves were suspicious of anything unfamiliar, especially plants that grew underground and did not have centuries of folklore backing them up. It did not help that potatoes could not be milled. In a world where grinding grain into flour was a full-time job and bread was the cornerstone of nearly every meal, potatoes had no obvious place. You could not make them into beer. You could not turn them into flour easily. You could not store them well in damp cottages with no ventilation. They were a logistical nightmare. Meanwhile, tomatoes suffered from the double curse of association with vanity and disease. Some believed their acidity corroded the stomach. Others thought they were aphrodisiacs, dangerous in a world where lust was a sin and digestion was a moral issue. Medieval Europe did not just eat to survive. It ate according to rules, and tomatoes did not follow them. So these two new world crops waited, not in silence, but in slow, Creeping acceptance. The poor might try them first, especially during famines. A desperate cook might boil potatoes for a sick child. A curious friar might test a tomato in a medicinal tonic. And little by little, the taste spread. By time they found their way onto broader tables. These foods no longer carried the weight of suspicion. They carried the promise of change. And when change finally came, it was delicious. The turning point was not loud. No trumpet announced the potatoes' redemption. No royal feast hailed the tomatoes' arrival. But somewhere in the fields of Ireland, a farmer harvested a hearty crop of these odd underground lumps, and did not starve that winter. Somewhere in a Neapolitan kitchen, a cook spooned stewed tomatoes over flatbread and discovered magic. And just like that, Europe's relationship with food shifted forever. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the once feared vegetables became staples. Potatoes proved perfect for poor soils, stored well in cold climates, and delivered the calories needed to survive another brutal winter. Peasants adopted them. Nobles accepted them. Armies marched on them. Tomatoes took longer. Their breakthrough came in the warmer regions of southern Europe, particularly Italy and Spain. There, they were slowly integrated into sauces, stews, and rustic dishes. They fit so naturally into Mediterranean cuisine that by the time industrial cookbooks arrived in the 19th century, tomato sauce was traditional, despite being the culinary equivalent of a very stylish immigrant. One mainstream historical fact: by the 1800s, potatoes had become a core survival crop across Europe, especially in Ireland, where over-reliance on them would later lead to tragedy during the Great Famine. Meanwhile, tomatoes were finally being grown commercially, praised for their versatility, and beginning to define entire national cuisines. And here's your quirky finish. In some parts of England, early adopters of potatoes believed you had to boil them in holy water to make them safe to eat. Others advised planting them only on Good Friday and sprinkling the field with prayers, just in case the devil had planted one by mistake. Historians still argue whether Europe needed these foods, or whether their success was an accident of timing and desperation. Would Italian food have still become iconic without tomatoes? Could Irish farming have pivoted to another crop if potatoes had not shown up? And what about the social shift? How much of the peasant diet was forever altered because of these foreign imports? What is certain is this: the Columbian Exchange did not just move plants. It moved possibilities. It gave Europe the ingredients to survive longer, cook better, and flavor bolder. It painted the table with reds, yellows, and earthy browns. It turned famine foods into comfort food legends. And if you sit down today to enjoy a bowl of gnocchi and tomato sauce, a plate of fries, or even just a slice of pizza, you are eating something medieval Europe never knew to miss, and eventually could not live without. So now, imagine a bowl in your hands, steaming, rich with warmth and scent. Picture the golden flesh of a roasted potato, the bright tang of tomato sauce, the flavors that shaped your childhood or your last lunch. These things were not inevitable. They were strange gifts from afar, once feared, now beloved. Let that idea settle like broth in your chest, that even in the most rigid world, change finds its way, from dirt to distrust, from suspicion to supper. Tomatoes and potatoes earned their place. And medieval Europe, it never saw them coming.